were banned from meeting or speaking on a Washington University campus. May 1980, Christian groups on the University of Missouri campus were also silenced. That case now pending before the U.S. Supreme Court. November 1980, the appearance of the Ten Commandments in Kentucky schools was ruled unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. December 1980, cases appeared across the nation trying to remove the right of communities to sing Christmas carols or display nativity scenes on public property.
And this year, the ACLU is suing to tear down a statue of Jesus Christ that has stood for decades in an Oklahoma national park. These are just a sampling of cases emphasizing the Supreme Court trend to remove our religious heritage from the American way of life. The American Civil Liberties Union, however, is the most powerful opponent in court cases from one corner of the country to the other. The fact is, the ACLU has led the fight in state after state to outlaw any public display of faith, and their members openly write about their efforts to undermine the new spirit of revival in America. What alarms many Americans is its published strategy to invade the judiciary. Before the last presidential election, the ACLU boasted that it had seen more of its members appointed to federal judgeships than in any time in history, and its infiltration continues. The ACLU has declared its plans now to push as many cases before the Supreme Court as possible, fearing that the makeup of the court may become more conservative as Supreme Court justices retire.
On Capitol Hill, the fight to protect liberty is raging on several fronts. Leading the battle against socialist and humanistic forces is Senator Jeremiah Denton of Alabama. A former Vietnam prisoner of war, Denton knows firsthand the value of protecting our heritage. But as chairman of the Subcommittee on Security and Terrorism, Denton has faced a smear campaign by the ACLU and others who are antagonized by his work.
This bill I mentioned to you, which simply intends to, well, its real purpose is to get rid of a magazine called Covert Operations, which is run by a man named Wolf, W-O-L-F. And that magazine undertakes as its only objective, with some peripheral activities, the disclosure of names of agents of the United States, CIA agents around the world. That's all they do. And they also have a lot of anti-American stuff along with it, but they disclose 4 or 5, maybe a week. And some of these men are killed. All of them lose their utility to the United States. The other day, when we had hoped to have a vote on that hearing and were delayed by maneuverings on the by some liberals, the 2 ACLU people, including the president, came up with Wolf himself, who was the editor of that magazine and has been called by the Washington Post even as a real serpent. They came up to us and they said, when do you think you're going to renew this hearing? We said, next week. They said, oh, no, you won't. They said, it'll be September. And they said, you just wait and see. And sure enough, it was maneuvered so that we won't have the next hearing until mid-September. I was prepared to believe that the ACLU was sincere. That suasion is wearing off. I recently learned by reading, there's a little sex newspaper that's put out here in Washington, D.C. called Met Personals, which is a lively little advertising of individuals or groups' desires to have different kinds of sexual activities, usually perverted. Sells for 75 cents a copy and is usually found right along the Washington Post. But at any rate, ACLU is featured in this week's issue as having an offshoot called FACTS, Facts. I've forgotten what the acronym stands for, but it is pushing for the complete legitimization of this type of activity. Not only the advertisements, but the group sex parlors where all this thing goes on. So it's sort of tied up the strategic thing, the moral thing affecting the family. Those are tied together as far as conscious efforts to undermine the security and well-being of the United States.
What effect are all these challenges having on your life and that of your family? Well, many Americans believe we are rapidly approaching the day when religious freedoms will no longer be a right, but only a privilege to be exercised as the government permits.
The growing crisis has caused a major stir in the legal community, and the best Christian legal minds in the country rallied recently at Notre Dame University to plan a defense of our inherited freedoms. These assessments were given of the fight ahead and the future of religious liberty.
You see, the government, those people who are the regulators, would like to say, you guys stick to religion. As long as you, quote, stick to religion, end quote, we'll leave you alone. That is, you can sing all the gospel songs you want, you can believe anything you want, you can have your little churches. It's sort of a concept of territoriality. They're willing to give religion a little piece of turf and say, okay, you stay over there and we'll leave you alone. But when you get involved in education or science or the arts or philosophy, now you're not really religion anymore, that's our sphere. Well, a counter philosophy would say, no, we haven't given to government the exclusive right to be involved in education and science and the arts and philosophy. That a person who understands their Christian faith in terms of the lordship of Christ and God's movement in history and the kingdom sees every area of life as an arena for discipleship.
At least 40 of the states right now, there's cases going on with Christian schools. Pastors are even being threatened by the state to receive a license or do this or that they feel is against their religious beliefs. The result, if things continue in the same vein, is very similar to what's happened in a lot of the communist countries.
What's ahead of us? Probably there will be some form of elite authoritarianism, as I suggested in the book, How Shall We Then Live? Now, this will be especially so if it is brought in under the guise of constitutionality, as it was in the time of Caesar Augustus. That's what happened back there. And if it can be brought in, some sort of an elite authoritarianism, under the form of a constitutional constitutionality, I don't think for most people there would be a wave. I would say that the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, with its now avowedly sociological law, because they acknowledge that this is what they're functioning on, and also the power to make law, which is also now the case with the Supreme Court, and the power to dominate the other two parts of government, it must be considered as one of the possible candidates.
Why won't they let the Christian students and parents just do what they want to do, since they're not really hurting anybody, right?
That's right.
I think the reason is because it's warfare. It's a condition of irreconcilable hostility between two views of reality. One view is that God is the ultimate reality. The other view simply is that the state is God. I believe it's warfare. I think that's a proper word for it. And it's a warfare which I think we're going to win.
While the legislative fight continues, the courts are expanding their powers and have become a successful vehicle for groups opposed to religious freedom. Senator John East of North Carolina chairs the subcommittee on the separation of powers.
The problem of the courts in general, and the Supreme Court in particular, of usurping legislative function, that is a serious problem. It's a legitimate charge. The power of judicial review, which is the power of the Supreme Court to hold acts of Congress unconstitutional or other legislative bodies, is not provided for in the Constitution. It was first described in the Federalist Paper number 78, where Hamilton defined it in a very narrow way, that the power of judicial review was to be used only to strike down acts of legislative bodies, the Congress, where those acts were contrary to the express provisions of the Constitution. Hamilton cautioned that the court should not substitute its will for that of the legislative body. That view was reflected in Marbury versus Madison, the 1803 case that began the power of judicial review. Very limited conception. Today, the court has gone way beyond that. Several things you could do. First, you would hope that just the discussion, a dialogue on it, that the court would see the point and begin to pull back itself. That would be the best way. Another way you can control it is through the appointing process. That's very important. Appoint people to the courts that have a sound conception of what is the role of the court. Then you have other remedies that you can use. You can withdraw the jurisdiction of the appellate jurisdiction, for example, of the United States Supreme Court, which the Constitution gives to the Congress. You can withdraw the jurisdiction of the lower federal courts. Indeed, you could even abolish the lower federal courts under the grant of power to the Congress under the Constitution. So those are remedies that you might use. I'm particularly talking about restricting or limiting court jurisdiction where they have been particularly abusive. Ultimately, of course, you have such remedies as amending the Constitution to overturn court decisions that are particularly unacceptable to the body politic generally.
At a campaign stop in Dallas in 1980, this warning was sounded by then-candidate Ronald Reagan.
If we have come to a time in the United States when the attempt to see traditional moral values reflected in public policy leaves one open to irresponsible charges, then the structure of our free society is under attack and the foundation of our freedom is threatened. Under the pretense of separation of church and state, religious beliefs cannot be advocated in many of our public institutions, but atheism can. You know, I've often had a fantasy. I thought of serving an atheist a delicious gourmet dinner and then asking he or she whether they believed there was a cook. When I hear the First Amendment used as a reason to keep traditional moral values away from policymaking, I'm shocked. The First Amendment was written not to protect the people and their laws from religious values, but to protect those values from government tyranny. This is what Madison meant when he drafted the Constitution and that precious First Amendment. This is what the state legislatures meant when they ratified it. And this is what a long line of Supreme Court decisions have meant. But over the last 2 or 3 decades, the federal government seems to have forgotten both that old-time religion and that old-time Constitution.
Hello, I'm Bob Schlosser. What you've just seen is only part of the story. The invasion of the courts into the home, the family, the schools, and the church is beyond anything our founding fathers would have imagined. That's why thousands of Americans are coming together to consider what can be done to preserve our liberties, to form the Freedom Council. If you'd like further information on the Freedom Council in your area and how you may participate, write to the Freedom Council, Post Office Box 64323, Virginia Beach, Virginia. The zip code is 23464. It's been said that all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. Think about it. God bless you.
We invite you to join us again next week at this same time for The Rock. For a complete catalog of CBN cassettes listing this program and others, write Cassettes, CBN, Virginia Beach, Virginia, 23463. The preceding program was sponsored by the Christian Broadcasting Network, Incorporated, and made possible by private contributions.